So with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Well, Kerry, thank you very much for the presentation, and well, some really amazing aspects about how some unforeseen impacts due to climate and drought and those sorts of things. So as Kerry said, she'll take some questions. We have till 6 o'clock as part of this program. If you could put your questions in the chat, then I will moderate them and ask some questions. So we do have a couple questions. Let me go and start asking them. So our first question is, do you have any idea? Oops, I just lost my chat. Hold on here.
Oh, that was my phone. Sorry.
It's okay. So let's see here. Kerry, do you have any idea of how much of the biomass that contributes to elevated ammonia is a result of dead bees rather than other sources?
That is a really good question, and I don't. We tried to look at out of dead bee coverage was correlated with the amount of whether it's ammonia, nitrate, or nitrate. And there is so much going into the systems that we didn't see a strong signal. If it's not dead bees, it's something else. So
did bees use the catchments to the same level as they did the Tanahas?
Yeah. What they'll do is they come down. So these are killer bees. These are Africanized bees. And they come down during the hot periods to any of the waters. And what they're doing is they're getting wet and they're going back to the hive to cool the hive. Now, as long as you kind of work through them and you don't react to them, they ignore you. But if they start paying attention to you, and they'll turn around and they'll look at you and start bopping you in the chest if they're irritated at you being there. And at that point in time, it's time to back up and let them do their thing. And I don't want to minimize the risk, because if you're out there and you run onto a hive in the rocks, you need to run. There is a different behavior where they're protecting the hive versus where they're getting water.
Okay. Now,
but they use both of them just the same.
Did the bees in Arizona become Africanized?
I think the Africanized bees came up from South America. I don't remember when, but okay, they've been there for a long while.
Yeah, because I'm just curious as to the native bee populations, because I'm sure flies and other kinds of bees use those water sources too, right?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
And I have some great pictures of some really cool, like bright blue wasps and like giant ones. But yeah, there are lots of different organisms that use these things.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. So our second question has to do with the catchments themselves. And the question is, how are the catches built, and can they be built so that they clean themselves?
That's a really good question. And I need to find an engineer that wants to work with me. Because you'd think there should be a way that we could make that happen. And if we can make that happen, that will take us a significant step forward in kind of adapting the system to the new conditions, basically mitigating for those conditions. But that is not my specialty. One of the things that we've been doing is working with aerators to increase the turnover and increase volatilization, which does help bring those concentrations down. But redesigning the catchments would be perfect. That's where we need to go.
Sure. Well, this question looks at the issue of nitrogen and the catchments from a different perspective. And the person asked, I was wondering if there was consideration for vegetation, obviously drought resistant, or soil that would take up the nitrogen in these catchments.
So the catchments and the Tanahas are both small. Catchments even smaller, and they're actually pretty shallow as well. So it's okay. I get to nerd out slightly. So what's going on? You get all this gunk in the bottom, which decomposes, releases ammonia. What's happening? You don't have the volatilization, but also the ammonia is concentrated enough. Dissolved oxygen is low enough. You don't get it to transform into nitrate and nitrate. And so there's not enough room for extra soil, at least the way they're designed now, and they're actually pretty small. And I don't know, with the amount of input of organic matter, that there's enough surface area to get those levels down currently. So it's one of those, it's like a trade-off thing. Okay, we really want water there. We need it there. We need it there for a long time. But we really should be doing it in a way that it can refresh itself in terms of quality, not just put out some more water into the same kind of nasty pool.
Okay, very good. So one of the questions that came to my mind, I mean, as you know, I've worked in Sonoran a little bit too on soils. I guess my question has to do with, prior to the use of catchments, what was the populations and community structure of some of the toads and other amphibians that just relied on these tanahs? I mean, have the catchments for some species worked and others not?
That's a really good question. So we're actually working on that right now. Hopefully we'll have a paper coming out spring, maybe. So it depends on the type of year. So you've got these catchments out there, and the hope, what we want is those to be a resource when we don't have a lot of water. So we really want those to be a good resource when there's a drought. Seeing with the amphibians is they actually they'll use the catchments when it's a normal rain year, but not when it's a drought. And so they aren't providing kind of the landscape connection that we would want. They aren't providing the resource. So the toads are still using the tanahas like they did. And probably the red-spotted toad is doing probably the best job of all of them, taking advantage of the catchments. But we've got some questions about Sonoran toads. I've got a graduate student working on them now because we're not finding them breeding. We do find metamorphs occasionally, but it's just not like we should. So something going on with them.
Yeah. So the other question I had relative to this too is, I mean, you know, if you go back in historical times, the Sonoran Desert, like the Chihuahuan, goes through periodic episodic drought cycles. So I guess the question is, in terms of the severity of the droughts in the last 20 years compared to the previous 100 years, what have you seen in terms of that change? I'm sure in terms of frequency and duration they have, but you know, the population dynamics are key to those cycles also. So what do we know about that interrelationship?
We don't.
So that's a good response. Yep.
Well, think about it. Who in their right mind is going to study toads in the desert?
Sure.
It's not a place you normally think about going to study toads. It's really hard because if there's a drought, are they even going to breed? So there's some work, but not back with what you're talking about. There's very little.
Okay. Well, hey, and I guess part of this came in the time I was at New Mexico State. We did some work on spadefoot toads and ephemeral playas in some of these rangeland areas. I take it these toads don't do that in those kinds of habitats, or do they?
That's a good question. And so the areas down in between The mountain ranges. And so most of the Chinahas and then the catchments are associated, they're fairly close to the mountain ranges. The basins in between have areas called charcos. And so
Okay.
charcos are like, you could think mini playas, just depressions that hold water for short periods of time. And the Couch's spadefoot is the one down there, and they would be best at taking advantage of that resource when it's around long enough for them to develop. And it just depends, because that particular species, it can get out from being an egg laid through metamorphosis in like 9 days. And
Wow.
so those, but can do that. But the other species of toads, they take more over a month. And so the charcos just aren't there long enough. At least most of them aren't.
Okay. Oh, interesting. And do are these species seen further south into Mexico, or are they subspecies up in the Arizona area?
Depends on the species. Actually, I don't know well enough how far south their ranges go, but like the red-spotted toad actually has a pretty large range. The Couch's spadefoot goes over a couple different deserts. I think the Sonoran desert toad would have the most restricted range.
Mm-hmm. So they're not relics necessarily from the last glaciation when the Sonoran was a little bit more cooler and wetter, were they?
Probably. I think you can probably say that about any of the amphibians in these regions, whether it is Sonoran Desert, Mojave, or even Chihuahuan.
Yeah, right.
We may have worked on some of the same waters over in the Chihuahuan, because I did work over there during my postdoc. So
interesting. So it's just curious, and because these deserts go through those larger cycles in terms of what the planet's been doing. But as you indicated, the biggest challenge is with the extreme weather and unpredictability of rainfall. Yep. So we have another question related to the catchment, which is an interesting one. And this person asks, is there an aquifer in the area that can be tapped?
you can pulling that there probably is. What Arizona uses most, and so my probably is someone, I know there's some people from Arizona here who can correct me on that. Water is often used from, there's some well water. Actually, yes, there is aquifers. There's well water, and then the cap system, where water is brought down from the Colorado River through the, it's a cement, word is completely gone.
Yep.
Yeah. And so like when the managers are supplying waters to these wildlife waters in this particular region, they're most often getting it from wells.
Okay.
City of Ajo has a really nice, very deep system where they have hot springs. And then, which is why you can never get cold water there. And when they need to, they'll also pull it from the cap system. So, and bring it down depending on how close they are. Okay,
very good. So I see there's another question related to the water quality. So I will mention this. You mentioned a volatilization and need to increase dissolved oxygen. Could battery operated aeration devices be explored?
Yes, and they are. So what we've done, and this is with the military, is we've carted out solar panels, marine batteries, and small pond aerators. And so we've established aerators in some of the catchments, we found that it doesn't increase evaporation too much. It does take down the ammonia levels through increased volatilization. It doesn't increase evaporation too much, and wildlife seem to be fine with it. We're problem solving that now because any sort of tube, anything plastic, the small mammals are going to eat. So you need to have a way to put it in that it's not, you don't have those cords. I really think that we should explore like wind and a wind turbine to turn water and increase that volatilization. But again, I need an engineer that wants to work with me. I got the aerator set up, but I'd like to try windmills because that would be a whole lot easier. We've had, if something trips over the line, things get dislodged, and then, you know, it takes a while to get down there and get it fixed.
So I'm assuming from the pictures you showed too, because I was thinking about this, you know, based on the work we've done at the Jornada on transport of carbon and nitrogen across the landscape. These catchments really are just taking laminar flow across the soil surface, and that's what they're using. So when you get a good heavy rain, you just get cross surface movement, right?
Right.
So let me ask you a question. What would be the possibility? And again, I realize that if all the carbon coming in and nitrogen is from bees, that's one thing, right? Because you can't control that. But what happens if you had a two-tiered system where you like a septic system, where you let some of it settle out and then pump it up to another position? If you're talking about solar panels or wind.
So that's kind of the system is set up that way initially. So the water collects, and in most of them, although there are some where bees and other things can get in, but in most of them you have that water and you don't have the accumulated nitrogen ions. You don't have the issues with water quality. And then it gets flows down into the troughs, and it's where that water is open and accessible. That's where you're going to get algae. That's where you're going to get bees. That's where you're going to get all those sorts of things. Okay.
Well, there is a question in the chat that concerns the sort of the engineering aspect too, and that is there any information on what happens when water is diverted or more catchments created versus natural reservoirs? Is there a consequence to too much human intervention in these systems?
That's a good question. And like anytime that you're talking about wildlife management, management is a combination between human wants, desires, goals, and so forth, and the science. And so if our goal is to have wildlife continue in the Sonoran Desert and buffer them against changing temperatures, there's got to be intervention. If we're not worried about that and we're like, okay, we know climate change is happening, we're going to let it go because we can't do anything about it, well, then not. But it's where your priorities are. And me personally, I'd rather keep the Sonoran toads around and Sonoran pronghorn and all these really cool and interesting species. So it's a judgment call.
Sure.
There's no right or wrong answer on that.
Okay. One thing that I was wondering, and I may have missed it. What temperature does this water get to during the summer?
It's hot.
Yeah.
So talking in degrees Celsius, upper 30s, even into the low 40s.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, it's hot, but think about it. Sometimes they're getting really shallow, so it's getting, really
right.
hot.
Okay. Interesting. So if you had to go back over these couple years and think about what else you would need to understand this, particularly the nitrogen and this, because you were mentioning earlier about the species of red toads not breeding, right?
Yeah, the Sonoran toads.
Yeah, and what's going on? What else would you collect, in relative to your weather climate that might shed some other light?
Right now, still, and actually, I see Tom Jones is on here. He's a state herpetologist with Arizona Game and Fish. We're still trying to get some of the basic information down. And so, like, I know there are Sonoran toads there. We have them breeding in town all the time. They're breeding up in Tucson early in the year. What's going on? We don't have the information on how the toads are responding to the changes in water availability, changes in water quality. And so what we're doing right now is looking at basically how we're looking at the population structure and age structure to try and figure out if we already have a serious issue, that we're not getting reproduction in like the larger bodied Sonoran toads, which generally take, I think it's a month and a half to develop, somewhere around there. And if the hydro period, so that time water is available, is getting shorter, and they have fewer opportunities to actually get out and develop, they're large bodied enough, they could be hanging around for a while before we know that there's actually something critical.
Mm-hmm. So you haven't seen, as with other species, you haven't seen changes in the male-female ratio over time?
I can't answer that. We haven't looked at that. We might have the data too, though. But a lot of, and that's because we added in a disease component. And so we did a lot more hands-on, but we haven't looked at that yet.
So are there chytrids in that area too?
There shouldn't be, but there are.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an area that's not, so for those of you that don't know, there is a chytrid fungus that has caused huge declines in amphibians across the globe. So populations just plummeting. But then you can find it in some places it doesn't impact them at all. We don't understand what's going on with that. But it's not supposed to be in the desert because it's a cooler species. It's supposed to die at these temperatures. It's supposed to die at the pHs we see in these waters. But we found it there. And so I've got a student right now who did her master's and is now working on her PhD, trying to figure out what's going on with that disease. She's looking at landscape genetics and how it got in and how's it surviving? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and toads are supposed to be more resistant than frogs. So, in terms of how this fungus affects them. Oh, there's a comment from Tom Jones that I will read, and he appreciates. He says, "You sufficiently capture the state of our knowledge."
And Tom's awesome.
That's good. That was good. So I guess we have time for one or two more questions, but one of the things that obviously come up is Arizona obviously is not the only state that's having these issues. And so what do places like, that part of California or New Mexico or Nevada, I take it, how are they approaching some of these same sort of species climatological issues with their amphibians, or do you know?
So the water supplementation programs, those are happening throughout the Western US. And I know at least some state agencies are cleaning waters and trying to improve water quality. I am not sure beyond that
Okay.
right now. So,
Okay. Okay.
because
So,
getting to these things really is problematic. It
right.
takes a long time.
Yeah. 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 And I guess, if you look, I have a little bit of knowledge of Southern Arizona a bit, and I'm assuming the same sorts of efforts are going on in the national parks and other places around that region.
It depends on how many natural waters they have.
Okay.
But any land management agency has to prioritize. And personally, I think water should be high on any of their lists because they need them, whether they're talking toads or bighorn or whatever. But it depends on their priorities, and they can't do everything. They don't have enough money for that. So,
okay. Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. Well, Kerry, we have reached our 6:00 time, and I want to thank you very, very much for your efforts here. And for all of you that have joined us tonight, appreciate that.